The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song at Cedar Creek Medical, the kind of sound that got inside your skull and never left. Brooke Sullivan pushed a medication cart down the fourth-floor corridor at 11:33 p.m., her movements economical, no wasted steps, no wasted breath. Antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. Rubber soles quiet on tile. The night shift had that particular quality of emptiness that only hospitals understood, the skeleton crew moving like ghosts through sterile hallways while the city slept outside. She wore scrubs the color of driftwood, a stethoscope draped across her shoulders with the casual authority of someone who'd worn far heavier equipment. Her jacket hung in locker 847 in the break room, navy blue, coffee-stained, unremarkable. Except for the patch sewn into the lining. Faded now. Threadbare at the edges. A unit patch from a lifetime ago, stitched carefully by hands that had forgotten how to be gentle. She touched the outline of it sometimes when no one was watching, fingers finding the raised embroidery the way a believer might touch a rosary. Her left leg favored slightly as she moved, the limp barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't trained to notice. Physical trauma tells stories if you know the language. She moved like someone who'd learned to compensate, to work around the damage, to keep functioning because stopping had never been an option. 12 years of that. 3 tours of that. 2 Purple Hearts worth of that, though those medals were somewhere else now, somewhere buried, somewhere that didn't exist anymore. The ER bay doors slid open as she approached, motion-activated and obedient. Cedar Creek Medical occupied a square block in Colorado Springs, 7 stories of reinforced concrete and modern intentions. Private hospital. Good reputation. Wealthy patient base. Dr. Harold Pierce had made sure of that reputation personally, the way men like him made sure of things, with charm and connections and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Brooke passed through the triage area where the fluorescent lights were brightest, where nothing could hide. The plexiglass partition at the front desk was spotless. She'd wiped it down at 10 p.m., then again at 11, then once more just before midnight because the work was never finished. It never was. There was always another surface to clean, another chart to review, another patient to check on. Motion was safety. Stillness meant thinking. She didn't want to think. The break room sat at the eastern end of the 4th floor, past the post-op bays, past the trauma suites where machines breathed for people who couldn't. She pushed open the door and the smell changed, old coffee now, microwave popcorn from someone's dinner, the faint ghost of bleach. A Formica table. For chairs. A refrigerator that hummed louder than it should have. She set down her cart and moved to the chart rack, flipping through patient files with methodical precision. Post-op inventory sheets. Surgical supply orders dating back 18 months. Her eyes caught it immediately, the way they were trained to catch anomalies. Small discrepancies first. Then bigger ones. Then a pattern that didn't make sense unless someone wanted it not to make sense. She ran her finger down the columns. Build for surgical instruments. Build for grade A titanium screws. Build for polymer scaffolding and precision sutures and specialized retractors. The quantities matched the orders. The prices matched the market rates. Except the numbers didn't match what actually arrived in the supply bays. Not by a little. Not even by the 5 to 10% that could be explained by breakage or loss. By significant margins. Hundreds of thousands of dollars significant. She traced the initials next to each order. Same signature every time. Dr. H.P. Dr. Harold Pierce. She didn't move. Her breathing stayed level. Her face remained blank. But something inside her shifted, the way a lock turns when the key finds the mechanism. Her hand set down the chart very carefully. Later, she would think about whether to report it. Later, she would consider the consequences. Later, she would understand that knowing things was dangerous. But in that moment, in the fluorescent-lit break room at midnight, she simply saw the problem and filed it away with the same compartmentalization that had kept her alive in Kandahar. The intercom crackled overhead. Post-op bay, incoming transport. Major Castellano, shrapnel wounds, Hindu Kush, ETA 2 minutes. Brooke's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She closed the chart and moved toward the bay without hurrying. No one moved faster than necessary in a hospital. It invited questions. It made you noticed. She had spent 17 months at Cedar Creek Medical cultivating the art of being invisible, of being the quiet nurse who kept her head down and never made waves. The one people forgot about 15 seconds after she left the room. But some people couldn't be forgotten. Some people arrived on gurneys with shrapnel in their chest and a rank that meant command and a face that brought back 17 years in a single breath. Major Rick Castellano was moving when they wheeled him in, already waking from the transport sedation. Broad-shouldered. Military bearing, even flat on a stretcher. Bandages wrapped around his left side where the shrapnel had entered below the ribs. His eyes tracked the paramedic speaking to him, tracking tracking the room. That was the thing about people trained to survive, they noticed everything. Brooke moved to the post-op bay and began setting up without being asked. Cardiac monitor. Pulse oximeter. Blood pressure cuff. The equipment arranged itself through her hands as if they knew the work better than her mind did. Muscle memory. She'd learned that phrase in nursing school. They never explained that some muscle memory came from places that didn't exist anymore, from training that was supposed to be classified, from a life that had been ordered to disappear. She affixed the monitor leads to Castellano's chest and his vitals appeared on the screen. O2 sat 94. Heart rate steady at 68. BP 118/71. Good. Stable. She'd seen far worse. She'd held people together who'd been in pieces. His eyes found hers as she adjusted the monitor cable. Recognition flickered across his face like a light switch. Not shock. Something more controlled than that. Something military. The look of a man who'd just solved an equation that didn't make sense. Captain Sullivan, he said. His voice was rough from intubation, but steady. I didn't know you were in Colorado Springs. She didn't look up from the monitor. Her hands continued their work, steady as surgical lasers, steady as something that had been forged in places too dangerous to name. I'm not, sir. You're hallucinating from the transport sedative. Try to rest. She adjusted his foredrip with careful precision, checking the flow rate. The pharmaceutical solution moved through the tubing at exactly the right speed to maintain his sedation without overshooting into danger. Funny, Castellano said, his voice softer now. You saying that? She still didn't look at him. But she did pause for exactly 1 second. Long enough for him to know she'd heard. Long enough for him to understand that she'd made a promise and kept it hidden for 17 months inside a hospital where no one knew her name or her history or the fact that she'd once extracted him from a burning compound in San Juan Valley using a field thoracotomy with a combat knife and her own hands to stop the bleeding. Dr. Pierce appeared in the bay doorway 10 seconds later, his expression arranged into professional concern. Expensive watch. Tailored white coat. The kind of presence that filled a room the way fog fills a valley. He glanced at Castellano's vitals, then at Brooke, then back to the monitor. Good setup, Sullivan. Let's keep him stable for the night. If the wound shows any signs of infection by morning rounds, we'll need to run fresh cultures. Understood, Doctor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce smiled as he said it, the smile of a man who'd already begun calculating the cost of her attention. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the room like a scalpel, precise, calculated, designed to wound. Nurse Sullivan, perhaps you can explain to the Kowalskis why you administered 15 milligrams instead of the prescribed 10. He stood beside Major Castellano's bed with the family hovering like vultures, their faces already arranged in expressions of concern. Mrs. Kowalski's hand trembled on her husband's blanket. The room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Brooke's hand stayed steady on the blood pressure cuff. The numbers climbed, 138/82. Elevated, but not from the medication. From this. From him. The chart shows 15, Doctor. That's what I prescribed. The chart shows what I prescribed, he said, his voice dropping into that tone that made junior residents flinch. 10 milligrams. Are you calling me a liar, or are you simply incompetent? Her jaw clenched once. Barely visible. She finished recording the vitals, her movements economical and precise, each gesture a refusal to break. Neither, doctor. She continued her work as if he hadn't spoken, face blank as stone, though her knuckles whitened slightly on the clipboard. The silence in the room stretched like a held breath. Dr. Pierce turned to the Kowalskis with a practiced expression of concern, the kind that said he was the reasonable one, the concerned physician managing an unstable staff member. I apologize for Nurse Sullivan's carelessness. We'll be monitoring her work more closely from now on. What he didn't say, what only Brooke understood, was that he'd already altered the chart. The original order had been 15 milligrams. The medication had been correct. But the 10 he'd written into the system would remain. A ghost prescription that made her look either reckless or dishonest. Both were professional death sentences. She had no idea yet what would happen in the supply closet 3 hours later. Lunch came at 12:16 p.m. Brooke entered the break room and unwrapped her sandwich, turkey on whole wheat, the same thing she'd eaten for 4 days. The microwave hummed its constant hum. 4 nurses sat mid-conversation near the windows. They saw her, exchanged glances without speaking, the kind of communication that didn't require words. One grabbed her salad container. Another stuffed half a granola bar into her pocket. A third, Jennifer, who'd asked Brooke to cover her shift last month, muttered something to the others as they filed past. Supply closets free, Jennifer said to no one in particular. The message was clear. Don't sit with us. Don't eat near us. In 30 seconds, the room held only Brooke and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. She chewed mechanically, her eyes fixed on the wall calendar advertising a pharmaceutical company's antacid. The sandwich tasted like cardboard and institutional indifference. By Thursday morning, her name appeared on the unit assignment board in red marker under disciplinary watch, medication error investigation. 6 staff members stood reading it when she arrived, their conversations dying as she passed. One of them was Marcus, a respiratory tech she'd trained. He looked away first. Brooke picked up her patient files without slowing her stride, began her rounds as if the red letters didn't exist, as if her name wasn't already spreading through the hospital's communication networks like contamination. She'd worked 23 years without a single complaint, without a mark on her record. 1 week. It took 1 week for Dr. Pierce to turn the entire hospital into an audience for her professional execution. From the physician's lounge, Dr. Pierce watched her disappear toward the ICU. He pulled out his phone, his thumb already moving across the screen. Carol? It's Pierce. We need to discuss a personnel matter. Yes, the one I mentioned. I need the board's support on this. He paused, listening. No, not yet. But soon. I'm documenting everything. By next week she'll either resign or we'll have grounds for termination. He smiled. The smile of a man who'd already calculated the cost of her attention and found it acceptable. The supply closet at 1:15 p.m. was Brooke's sanctuary. Metal shelving on 3 walls, boxes of gauze and bandages and saline stacked in perfect order, the smell of industrial cleaning products and plastic. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelf, her fingers gripping the edge until they ached. Her breathing came slow and deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A technique she'd learned years ago, in a place she wasn't supposed to remember. The kind of breathing that kept you calm when people were dying. When your unit was pinned down. When everything you'd built was collapsing. 23 years. 2 deployments before David was born. 1 more after, when he was old enough to understand that his mother was gone sometimes and came back different. She'd traded the uniform for scrubs. Traded the field for the ER. Traded command for compliance. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be over. Major Castellano had changed that. 1 look at his name on the surgical manifest and everything came rushing back. Major James Castellano. 12 years her junior. Third in command of the mountain company when she'd led them through Cunha province. He'd taken a bullet meant for her in 2009. She'd carried him 400 meters through fire to the extraction point. They'd never spoken about it afterward, the way soldiers don't. But she'd promised him then, promised herself, that if he ever landed on her table, she'd bring him home alive. And now she was being erased for trying to do exactly that. The supply closet felt smaller than it should. The walls pressed in like a diagnostic of her isolation. Her hands hurt from gripping the shelf. She released it, pressed both palms flat against the cool metal instead, feeling the slight vibration of the hospital's machinery, the ventilators on the floors above, the ice machines in the patient rooms, the endless mechanical heartbeat that kept the institution functioning. She was just a nurse to them. Just another staff member whose name could be written in red marker and erased from the organization's conscience. But that wasn't the worst part. At 11:13 p.m. Thursday night, everything fractured. The ER doors exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the entire bay like a gunshot. A man, 6'5", muscled like a loaded weapon, eyes rolling white in his skull, stumbled through the entrance screaming. His voice wasn't human. It was the sound of a mind disintegrating from the inside out, broken into individual synapses firing randomly without coordination. "Get them out! Get the chips out of my head!" He lurched forward, and his right hand rose. It held a tire iron. The metal caught the fluorescent lights as he swung, and the triage plexiglass shattered into 1,000 pieces that cascaded like ice onto the floor. The waiting room erupted. A receptionist dove under her desk. 2 EMTs scrambled behind a gurney. Security guard Martinez, 62 years old, retired Marine, the kind of man who'd seen things, reached for his radio, his voice shaking in a way that told everyone at Cedar Creek Medical that no amount of training had prepared him for this specific moment. "Sir, we're here to help, just put down the..." The tire iron whistled past his head and embedded itself in drywall with the sound of splintering wood and torn plaster. Martinez backed toward the exit, hands up, palms open in surrender. The ER tech bolted toward the pharmacy. A nurse screamed. The waiting room became a stampede toward the exits. Everyone ran. Brooke Sullivan, 20 feet away at the medication station, set down her tablet. She looked at the man, at the chemical psychosis in his pupils, the twitching of muscles overloaded on something that wasn't adrenaline, the way he moved like a predator whose nervous system had been set on fire. She didn't run. She walked. Her stride was measured. Purposeful. Her posture shifted in the space between heartbeats, the nervous energy of the ER nurse evaporating like steam. When she spoke, her voice dropped into a register no one at Cedar Creek Medical had ever heard. It came from somewhere deeper than her throat. It came from Kandahar. From mountains. From years of commanding 47 soldiers under fire. "Stop. Look at me. Weapon down. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of command that reached past the chemical fog in his brain and found something older, the part of the human nervous system that recognizes authority and responds to it at the spinal cord level. The man swung anyway. The tire iron came up in an arc designed to end her. Brooke sidestepped with economy, moved like something apex and terrible, and caught his wrist mid-swing. Her hands, which had started and fallen 847 times in the last 5 years alone, which had held bleeding together with pressure and presence, redirected his momentum using his own weight against him. She guided him to the ground with techniques that weren't taught in nursing school. They were taught at Fort Bragg. In Kill House. In places that didn't exist on the hospital's employee training records. Her knee braced his shoulder. His chest was heaving. The tire iron lay on the floor, inert and suddenly small. "Breathe," she said, her voice dropping lower still, softer, the way she'd spoken to dying Marines. "You're safe. Breathe with me." Security arrived, 3 officers, running now, adrenaline flooding their systems, to find the man on the ground, contained, already calming as Brooke maintained the restraint hold, speaking in low, steady tones that seemed to untangle something in his fractured brain. His breathing synchronized with hers. In. Out. In. Out. The eyes focusing. The panic receding. In the silence that followed, a silence so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming, no one moved. No one spoke. Dr. Pierce stood in the hallway outside the physician's lounge, his phone halfway to his ear, watching the entire scene unfold. His expression shifted only once. A flicker. The briefest moment of calculation running behind his eyes as he registered that this quiet nurse had just moved with the precision and authority of someone trained for exactly this kind of violence. Then the moment passed, and his face went neutral again. But the phone stayed in his hand, and when he looked at Brooke, still on the ground with the subdued patient, still speaking in that steady voice, still in complete control of the chaos, something changed in his strategic assessment. He'd thought she was just a nurse. He was beginning to realize he was very, very wrong. The ER doors exploded inward at 11:24 p.m. A 6'5" man with wild eyes and sweat-soaked skin kicked through the entrance, a tire iron raised above his head like a club. His voice came out fractured, serpentine, government chips. They're transmitting. They're inside my skull and they're transmitting. The triage nurse dove sideways. A paramedic flattened himself behind the registration desk. A phlebotomist yanked a medication cart in front of her body like a shield. Within 4 seconds, the ER bay transformed from controlled chaos into a scatter pattern, staff evaporating behind doorways, under desks, into supply closets. The fluorescent lights cast everything in clinical white. The man swung the tire iron in a wide arc and the triage plexiglass shattered with the sound of 1,000 pebbles hitting tile. Brooke Sullivan was 30 feet away, charting vitals at a standing workstation. She did not flinch. She did not run. She walked toward him. Not quickly. Not dramatically. The way someone walks toward a door they're about to open. The way someone walks to a patient who's coding. Her eyes dropped to a neutral focal point, not his face, which would register as a challenge, but his center mass. Her hands hung loose at her sides, shoulders relaxed, stance balanced with weight centered over her feet. Every neuron in her body synchronized into something older than fear, older than protocol, something that had kept her alive in the Hindu Kush when helicopters were minutes away and the bleeding wouldn't stop. "I need you to lower the tire iron," she said. Her voice had changed. The deferential nurse vanished. What emerged was command cadence, the same measured register she'd used to direct field operations when 214 Marines were depending on her instructions and the radio crackled with casualty counts. Deep. Grounded. Non-negotiable. The man's dilated pupils swiveled toward her. "They sent you. You're one of them. You've got the chip too." "I don't have a chip." Her tone remained flat, clinical. "You're experiencing a medical emergency. Intoxication combined with auditory hallucinations. Amygdala activation causing threat perception. That's fixable." She was 3 feet away now. His grip tightened on the tire iron. The muscles in his shoulders coiled like a compression spring loaded to release. Brooke had seen this pattern before, the tensing of the latissimus dorsi, the way his weight shifted to his right hip, the angle of his elbows. She'd trained against it for 16 years. She knew what came next. When he swung, his movement was predictable as gravity. The tire iron arced from his right side toward her left temple. Brooke pivoted on her left foot, rotating her hips 90 degrees with her hands rising to intercept. The physics of leverage, not strength, were the weapon. Her left palm caught his wrist. Her right hand guided the momentum of the swing past her body and then down. Muscle memory took over. She didn't fight his motion. She redirected it, using the energy he'd generated against him, rotating beneath his arm, her hip driving forward. The tire iron dropped from his grip. Her hands moved, one securing his wrist, the other applying pressure to the radial nerve cluster in his inner elbow, not hard enough to damage, hard enough to trigger his nervous system's compliance response. The man dropped to his knees. The tire iron clattered across the tile floor and slid under a wheelchair. "Now we're going to stand up slowly," Brooke said. "And we're going to walk to Trauma Bay 3. The man stared at her. Recognition flickered across his face, not of her identity, but of something fundamental. The way a wild animal recognizes a predator dressed in human skin. Security arrived 90 seconds later, which was 45 seconds too slow. They found Brooke standing beside a man now compliant, almost catatonic, being guided toward a psych hold assessment. Her scrubs were undisturbed. Her hair was exactly where it had been. Her heart rate, she knew, was elevated to 118 beats per minute, but her breathing was measured and deep. "We're transporting him to Colorado Plains Medical for psychiatric evaluation," the security director said, not looking at her, not asking what had happened. "Good work." Brooke nodded. She returned to the workstation. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank as stone. Dr. Pierce watched from the medication dispensary alcove, unseen. He'd frozen in place when the doors exploded inward, like everyone else. But he hadn't run. He'd observed. And what he'd witnessed was a woman move with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory held things that nursing school didn't teach. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the way that nurse had spoken. By 11:58 p.m., Dr. Pierce had his phone out. By 11:59, he was dialing Carol Henstridge's private line. The board member answered on the second ring, she always did for him. That was one of the advantages of having covered her daughter's drug rehabilitation expenses 15 years ago. Favors created loyalty. "We have a serious liability issue," Dr. Pierce said quietly, his voice carrying the right amount of concern. "Sullivan just engaged a violent patient. Physical intervention. No protocol, no backup request, no de-escalation attempt. Excessive force. I'm concerned about her stability under pressure. We need an external investigator. Now." By 1:53 a.m. Friday morning, he'd called Denver General, where Brooke had worked before Cedar Creek. He'd reached Dr. Marcus Chen, the chair of emergency medicine, using careful language. "We're seeing some concerning patterns with one of your former staff. Just doing due diligence. Wondered if you'd noticed anything unusual. Any incidents where her judgment seemed compromised." Dr. Chen's pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I'd prefer not to comment on personnel matters." Which meant, there are things I can't say. Which meant, there are incidents in her file. Dr. Pierce smiled. Perfect. By 6:16 a.m. Friday, he'd already submitted his written incident report to hospital administration. By 8:38 a.m., he'd placed an order with administration, patient 340B reassigned to Dr. Pierce primary care. R.N. Sullivan restricted from patient care pending investigation into incident from 11:19 p.m. Thursday. Brooke read the directive on the unit board at 8:24 a.m. The red marker was already fading. She stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, then continued her shift as if the words meant nothing. But Major Castellano was in 340B. And inside that room, the surgical drain in his left chest was showing something that made the monitors sing a different song. The drainage output had been steady, 30 milliliters per hour, for the first 36 hours post-op standard. Clean. By Friday morning at 8:45 a.m., it had slowed to 12 milliliters per hour. By 9:15 a.m., it was nearly clear. Which meant the bleeding hadn't stopped. It had stopped appearing in the drain because it was happening inside the thoracic cavity. The blood was accumulating in places where the monitors couldn't measure it directly, pooling where his lungs were supposed to be expanding, creating pressure against tissue that was already traumatized. His blood pressure had dropped from 138/72 to 121/68. His heart rate had climbed from 76 to 94 to 107. Dr. Pierce glanced at the monitor readings at 10:15 a.m. while standing in the hallway outside 340B. He had a board meeting in 35 minutes. The surgical supply contract renewal was worth $847,000 annually, and his kickback structure depended on maintaining favorable terms with the current vendor. The Ranger was post-op day 2, vitals were within acceptable parameters, and most importantly, he was stable enough that Pierce could afford to be distracted. Continue monitoring vitals every 30 minutes, he told the morning shift nurse, Dr. Sarah Whitmore. I'll reassess this afternoon. Then he left. The monitors beeped their irregular patterns. The chest drain output became nearly imperceptible. The blood pressure drifted down another 5 millimeters of mercury. Brooke watched from the doorway of adjacent room 340A, 20 feet away, forbidden to enter, suspended in a professional limbo while an investigation that didn't exist was supposedly underway. She could see the monitor from her vantage point. She could see the trajectory of his vital signs. She recognized the pattern because she'd seen it before, in a trauma bay outside of Sanjin Valley in Helmand Province, in a field hospital with 37 casualties arriving in 1 hour and 3 doctors and her, only her, to keep them breathing until the Black Hawk could evacuate the most critical. Slow bleed. Internal accumulation. Hours before the body decompensated into shock. She checked the hallway. Empty. The charge nurse was in the medication room. Dr. Pierce was in his office. Security detail was at the main entrance. Brooke walked into 340B. Major Castellano's eyes were closed. His right arm lay across his abdomen, his left arm connected to an 4 line that was running at maintenance rate. His breathing was shallow, consistent. She moved to the left side of his chest where the drain insertion was located, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the standard approach for hemothorax management. She examined the tubing. Clear fluid with just a hint of pink. The collection chamber showed maybe 15 milliliters of output in the past 3 hours. She pulled the crash cart closer to the bedside. Her hands accessed the chest drain equipment, pulling out a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a 3-way stopcock, and a tension pneumothorax kit, just in case. If his lung had been nicked by the blast fragmentation and the initial blood was the only drainage, the pressure inside his chest cavity could be building without releasing, creating a tamponade effect that would collapse his right lung and push his heart toward the left. Captain. His voice was barely a whisper. Brooke's hands paused. She looked at his face. His eyes were still closed. That you? His voice held something that wasn't a question. It held recognition. Brooke keyed her radio. Charge nurse, I need you in 340B. Now. Major Castellano's eyes fluttered open. His pupils were dilated but focused. He was coming out of the anesthesia enough to recognize certain patterns, certain voices. His brain was pulling fragments from memory even though the conscious mind was still swimming in post-operative fog. Someone who keeps promises, Brooke said quietly, preparing the needle. Her hands moved with the precision of someone whose credentials extended far beyond the nursing license in her locker. She was going to access his chest cavity, assess the drainage, and determine if the bleeding was contained or escalating. If Dr. Pierce caught her, her career at Cedar Creek Medical was finished. If she didn't act, David Sullivan's commanding officer would deteriorate into hypovolemic shock by late afternoon. The choice, really, had already been made in 2009 when she'd held him during extraction while a combat medic pressed gauze against his first wound. She'd made a promise then. She was keeping it now. The charge nurse's footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting closer. Major Castellano's chest drain filled with blood at 11:51 a.m. Friday, the crimson fluid pooling against clear plastic like a betrayal whispered in real time. Brooke stood 3 doors down, watching the monitor from the hallway, heart rate climbing, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation sliding from 92 to 89 to 85. The pattern was unmistakable. Internal bleeding. Shrapnel migration. A blood vessel nicked by the very fragments that had already nearly killed him in the mountains of Helmand Province, thousands of miles from Colorado Springs, thousands of miles from this moment when his body was failing and Dr. Pierce was in a board meeting discussing surgical supply contracts, leaving Castellano under the care of a resident who kept glancing at his watch. Brooke's jaw tightened. Not a flinch. Not a tremor. Just the smallest clenching of muscle as she walked to the supply closet, pulled on fresh gloves, and breached the doorway of room 340B without knocking. "You need to contact," the resident started. "He's bleeding internally. Chest tube output at 400 milliliters per hour. Pressure's dropping." Brooks' voice carried the weight of someone who had spoken over rotor blades. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, 2 units O negative, and a crash cart positioned outside this door. Now." The resident stared. The monitoring tech stared. But something in her tone, something that had nothing to do with hospital hierarchy and everything to do with the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to issuing orders when seconds mattered, made them move. Major Castellano's eyes fluttered. "Sullivan." "I'm here, sir." She was already positioning him, already prepping his left anterior chest wall with antiseptic solution that smelled like copper and chemical burn. "You're going to feel pressure. You're not going to move. Captain. Sinus rhythm or death, Major. Pick one." She found the fourth intercostal space at the mid-axillary line the way she had found it in a rooftop compound in Kandahar when Sergeant Rivera had taken shrapnel through the lung and the medevac was 30 minutes out and Rivera had 12 seconds before his body shut down. Muscle memory was a strange god. It lived in hands, not in mind. It lived in the space between thought and action, in the terrible efficiency of training that never fully left the body. The scalpel opened his chest in one fluid motion. Not surgery. Field medicine. The distinction mattered. The incision was direct, purposeful, the kind that doctors learned in textbooks and soldiers learned in tents illuminated by generator light and dying men. Blood welled up, dark, arterial, moving fast. She reached into her locker, the one that had held her scrubs and her lunch bag and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining for 7 years. She pulled out a combat knife, serrated edge, handle wrapped in black parachute cord, the kind of blade that wasn't in any hospital protocol and shouldn't exist in any ER but had existed in her hand since she was 23 years old in the Hindu Kush, practicing the techniques that kept people alive when standard medicine was an hour away by helicopter. The monitoring tech made a sound. Not words. Just a sound, small and strangled. Brooke opened the pericardium with a knife, accessed the bleeding vessel with her fingers, found it with the certainty of someone who had done this before, under fire, in darkness, with incoming rounds making percussion sounds against the concrete walls. 30 seconds. The vessel sealed. Pressure restored. She packed the cavity with gauze, her hands moving like a surgeon's but steadier, like someone whose hands had learned to be still in conditions where still meant survival. Major Castellano's oxygen saturation climbed. 90. 92. 94. His blood pressure rose as if by will alone. The monitors sang their beeping approval. Color returned to his face, not the pale gray of exsanguination but the warm flush of a man being given his life back one surgical moment at a time. "He's stable," Brooke said. Not a question. A statement. She was already washing her hands in the sink, blood spiraling down the drain, disappearing into the system. "Get Dr. Patel on the phone. He needs a proper OR thoracotomy for repair. Now." The resident was pale. The tech was pale. Castellano's eyes held hers, not gratitude, something deeper. Recognition. The kind of look someone gave you when you had looked death in the face using the same tools and came back saying, "Not today." Dr. Pierce arrived at 12:04 p.m. to find her at the sink, hands clean, the major's vitals displayed across the monitor like a confession. His face moved through colors, white to red like a sunrise in reverse. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "What did you do?" "My job." Brooke didn't turn around. Major stable. O2 sat at 96. Pressure holding. He needs the OR. You performed a surgical procedure without authorization. You violated my direct order to stay away from this patient. You used equipment that isn't standard protocol. You're finished here, Sullivan. The name landed different now. Not the way he'd said it before, dismissive, diminishing. He'd used her actual name like a curse word, like it was something toxic. She finally turned, her face blank as a medical chart, her voice quiet as someone could be and still be heard across a room. He was dying, Doctor. You were in a meeting about contracts. Pierce's jaw clenched. He spun toward the hallway and his voice changed, sharp, command level, the kind of urgency that usually preceded cardiac arrests. Security. HR, get someone to room 340B. This nurse is being removed from the hospital immediately. Pending investigation for patient endangerment and insubordination. By 2:06 p.m., Brooke sat across from Patricia Vance, Cedar Creek's HR director, a woman whose eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been called into an emergency situation at lunch. Beside her sat Ellen Mora, the external investigator Dr. Pierce had commissioned, sharp-featured, sharp-eyed, sharp in the way that suggested she had audited things bigger than hospital supply chains. On the table before Ellen lay Brooke's personnel file, thin and sparse, with handwritten notes in the margins. Your employment history is unusual, Ellen said. Her voice carried the precise cadence of someone accustomed to depositions. Your references at Denver General are vague. Your nursing certifications show gaps, 2 years where you list no employment, no medical license renewal, no continuing education credits. Where were you? Personal leave. Doing what, exactly? That's personal. Ellen's pen tapped once against her notebook. Dr. Pierce has documented a pattern of insubordination. Today's incident, performing a surgical procedure without authorization, suggests a dangerous lack of professional boundaries. The gaps in your employment history suggest you might be hiding something. Help me understand what. Brooke's composure was like stone, not cold, not defensive, just absolutely, immovably present. Her hands rested flat on the table. Her breathing remained even. She didn't answer. Patricia Vance shifted. Brooke, if there's something in your background, a health issue, a personal situation, we need to know. It could affect how we handle this. There's nothing to handle. He was dying. I saved him. I'd do it again. Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly. She made a note. Then she opened her laptop and turned it toward them both. I've been contacted by several parties regarding your background. Your previous employers. Military records. What I've found is unusual. She pulled up a screen, classified stamps, redacted paragraphs, the kind of official bureaucratic language that meant government secrets. Your employment records seem to have gaps that correspond with military operations in Helmand and Loga provinces. Your social security number is flagged in 3 different database systems as a national security, do not flag or contact. You were ordered to disappear, weren't you? The silence stretched. Patricia glanced at Ellen, then at Brooke. What is she talking about? Ellen leaned back in her chair. I don't know exactly. But whatever this is, it's bigger than Cedar Creek Medical. Bigger than insurance fraud. And unless I'm very mistaken, it's about to become a much larger problem for Dr. Pierce than it is for Captain Sullivan. The word landed. Captain. Not used as a title, used as identification. Brooke's face didn't change. Her breathing didn't change. But the air in the room seemed to shift, as if some invisible weight had been placed on the table and everyone could finally see it. How did you? Patricia started. Military database cross-reference, Ellen interrupted. Once you know what you're looking for, it's remarkable what the Freedom of Information Act will provide. She turned to Brooke. I'd like to officially recommend that Cedar Creek Medical terminate this investigation and issue a formal apology. I'd also like to recommend that they contact their legal team before they say anything else about you to anyone. By 5:11 p.m., Brooke stood at the bus stop on Nevada Avenue in the rain. The cardboard box rested on her hip, her locker's contents, reduced to what fit in her arms. The chipped mug that read World's Okayest Nurse. A succulent with brown-edged leaves that she'd watered every Sunday for 3 years. The photo of David at 17, in his rock dress uniform, the kind of pride in his bearing that came from knowing what his mother had done, even if he couldn't say it out loud. Rain hammered the pavement like distant artillery. Brooke didn't move to shield the box. Didn't wipe the moisture from her face. The water ran down her cheeks, mixing with something else, something that wasn't weather. She breathed through it the way she had breathed through 7 years of pretending to be ordinary. The way she had breathed through watching Major Castellano's blood pressure drop. The way she would continue to breathe, because that was what people did. They kept breathing, kept moving, kept living even when everything they'd built turned to smoke. A car pulled up to the bus stop. The window rolled down. Major Castellano's voice, rough from the oxygen and the recovery, but steady, "Get in, Captain." That's not a request. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause as Brooke Sullivan stood at the bus stop on Willow Street, cardboard box balanced on her hip. Her chipped World's Okayest Nurse mug rattled against a dying succulent, both rattling against the photo of David in his dress uniform. The moisture on her cheeks was indistinguishable from the weather. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't move. She simply waited for the 4:15 bus that would take her out of Colorado Springs, away from Cedar Creek Medical, away from the place where she'd saved lives for 7 years and lost everything in 7 days. The fluorescent glow from the hospital entrance 3 blocks away felt like someone watching her leave. By Friday, they'd made their choice. She'd made hers. The doors of Cedar Creek's administrative wing burst open at 8:56 a.m. Monday morning with the sound of hinges hitting stops. David Sullivan moved through that threshold like he was breaching a hostile position, his backpack open and spilling its contents across the polished conference table where Dr. Pierce sat with his hands folded, composed, flanked by board members in grey suits. Shadow box. That was what scattered across the table first. Medals catching the fluorescent light like brass rain. David's voice cracked as he spoke, 17 years old and trembling, the only person in the room allowed to shake. "Mom, they need to see these. The silver star. The bronze star with a V device for Valor. 2 purple hearts. Each one a mission. Each one a secret." The room went dead silent. From his hospital bed 2 floors down, Major Rick Castellano whispered 3 words through his oxygen mask, the hiss of air escaping around them. "Valkyrie," he said. The call sign that was supposed to stay buried. The call sign that made Martinez, the retired Marine security guard, snap to attention with the precision of a man who'd spent 30 years inside military protocols. His voice came low and steady as he read from a document Carol Henstridge had just placed in his hands. Silver Star citation. Combat operations. Kandahar Province. Fire support coordination under enemy engagement. Danger close air strikes that prevented, he paused, swallowed hard, prevented total unit annihilation. The words hung in the conference room like smoke. The 3-star general appeared in the doorway at 8:53 a.m. Nobody called for him. Nobody knew he was there until he rendered a salute so sharp it sounded like fabric tearing, his hand moving from his side to his forehead in the precise arc of someone who'd been saluting his entire adult life. He was descending from the oncology wing where he'd been visiting a colleague. He didn't explain why he'd stopped at administration. He didn't need to. The Pentagon liaison appeared behind him 60 seconds later, phone in hand, her voice cutting through the silence with the weight of federal authority. She spoke a code name that wasn't supposed to be spoken outside of secure facilities. Classified under National Security Directive 7847. Buried under 18 months of redaction protocols. Brooke Sullivan had been ordered to disappear because her operation in the Hindu Kush had produced 3 confirmed cures and a cover story that required her to vanish entirely. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old bone. Ellen Mora, the external investigator he'd commissioned 6 weeks ago, opened a folder with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years in white-collar crime investigations. She slid papers across the table one by one. 18 months of falsified surgical supply orders. Equipment billed to insurance but never delivered. A shell company called MedSource Solutions receiving payments, $340,000 over 18 months, whose registered agent was Dr. Pierce's brother-in-law. Titanium plates. Surgical robotics accessories. Hardware that existed only on paper. The Kowalski family had been billed $18,000 for specialized knee replacement implants. The actual cost was $3,100. The difference lived in 3 separate shell accounts that moved through offshore wiring protocols designed to obscure the trail. Ellen's voice remained steady as she placed each document down like a prosecutor laying out a murder weapon. When Nurse Sullivan began questioning inventory discrepancies, you needed her gone before she traced the pattern. Dr. Pierce's hand started to shake. Not with fear. With rage at being caught. The medication error you documented, Ellen continued, sliding another page forward, was fabricated. I pulled the pharmacy logs. The chart was altered after administration. Your handwriting, Dr. Pierce, changed from 15 milligrams to 10 milligrams after the fact. That's the document you used to discipline her. That's the document you're betting your career on. Carol Henstridge stood from her chair with the abruptness of someone who'd just realized she'd been sitting next to a thief. The general's face had hardened into something carved from granite. Major Castellano spoke from his hospital bed, voice moving through the speakerphone with the precision of a commander delivering intelligence. She saved my life twice. Once in the Hindu Kush when she was my fire support coordinator and called in danger close strikes that kept our position from being overrun. Yesterday, when she violated your orders because you were too busy with your supply contracts to notice I was bleeding internally. Open thoracotomy. With a combat knife because the ER was locked and you'd restricted her access. The words landed like artillery. Martinez's voice came low and steady from the security desk where he was still on speakerphone. He was the only person in that conference room, through video call, who'd been in the ER at 11:22 p.m. when that man stormed through the doors high on something that made his eyes roll white. She stopped him without escalation. No weapons. No backup. Everyone else ran. Nurses hit the ground. Doctors locked themselves in offices. She walked toward him. David's voice came next, cracking on every word but holding. She's been hiding for 2 years because she was ordered to. Because her mission was classified and people died and the government needed it buried. And you tried to destroy her for noticing you're a thief. The last word hung in the air like an accusation in a courtroom. Dr. Pierce pushed back from the table, standing with the sudden violence of cornered prey. I have rights. I have attorneys. This is defamation. The Pentagon liaison's phone rang. She answered, listened, spoke 3 sentences, and hung up. The FBI's white-collar crime division is in the lobby. They'd like to speak with you, Doctor. 6 months later, Brooke stood in the ER bay at Cedar Creek Medical, scrubs crisp and white, name badge reading, R.N. Sullivan, trauma leader in letters that took up 3 hours to have engraved. Through the windows, she watched Dr. Jeffrey Pierce load cardboard boxes into a medical supply delivery van in the parking lot, movement stiff and defeated. The temp agency paid $18 an hour for driver work. That was all he could get after surrendering his medical license, paying $340,000 in restitution, and accepting a plea deal that kept him out of federal prison by 4 months. He didn't look up as the van pulled away. His brother-in-law was facing separate charges. MedSource Solutions had been dissolved. The insurance companies had recovered $412,000 in fraudulent claims. None of it mattered to the man loading boxes into a vehicle that smelled of diesel and cardboard. Inside her locker, beneath her scrubs, Brooke's captain's bar sat in a small wooden box. Still hidden. Still hers. She reached past them every morning and every night. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, where it had been for 2 years, waiting for the moment when she could choose who she was instead of being ordered into invisibility. The Pentagon liaison had offered reinstatement. Full honors. Public recognition. Brooke had declined in a single sentence, I'm needed here. David appeared in the ER doorway wearing his ROTC jacket, new rank insignia showing on his collar. Mom, Major Castellano's asking for you. He's being discharged today. She nodded, pocketed her stethoscope with a precise economy of movement that came from a decade of field medicine. Rick Castellano sat on the edge of his hospital bed, dressed in civilian clothes, discharge papers signed. He stood when she entered, extended his hand with the grip of a commander who'd spent 18 years leading Rangers. "Captain," he said. The word wasn't a question. It was recognition. "Just Brooke here, sir," she said, and something in her voice shifted. Not deferential. Not hiding. Just Brooke. A choice instead of a cover story. "Rick, then." He held her hand firmly. "David tells me you're staying." Turning down the Pentagon's offer. "I'm needed here." That's what good officers do. Find where they're needed and stay there. He gestured to the window where morning sun lit the ambulance bay like a runway. "This is combat too. Different uniform. Same mission." Brooke's lips quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough that it counted. "Same mission," she said. As Rick left, David hovered in the doorway, and she watched him assemble the question before speaking. "Was it worth it? Hiding, I mean. Losing your rank, your unit, everything." She touched the outline of the patch through her scrub top, feeling the thread count and the memories stitched into the fabric. The Hindu Kush. The missions nobody knew about. The people she'd saved whose names she couldn't speak. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She turned back to her charts, pulled up the next patient file, and spoke the words that had become her entire life: "It was always worth it." Outside, Martinez raised his coffee mug in silent salute as she passed the security desk, and somewhere in the parking lot, the rain began again, not like applause this time, but like permission. If you made it this far, you know that silence doesn't mean weakness, and sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones nobody's watching. Subscribe to see more stories about the heroes hiding in plain sight, the ones who choose their battles and change everything without anyone knowing. Like this video if you think power should be measured by impact instead of title. Comment: have you ever been wrong about someone who turned out to be extraordinary? And hit that notification bell because next week we're telling the story of a security guard who noticed something nobody else could see.